So this auto syntax check, when that's checked, if you make a mistake on the line that you're typing, you get a dialog box. Have you experienced this dialog box yet? Yeah, there's like a button on it that says help. And if you click it, you're going to get absolutely nothing that's going to help you at all. And anyway, at least for me, it's annoying. So I always uncheck that. I will still know if I have a syntax error in my line because it'll still turn red, but it won't put up that message. That you can, just a lot of students are glad to know when I've told them how they can turn that off. But the other one that I want you to turn on is this one, require variable declaration. So we talked about variables a couple of weeks ago, a couple of sessions ago. And this one is just going to say, hey, when you create a new module, put a directive at the top of it that says if you're going to use variables, you've got to declare them. And we'll be talking about that a little bit today. So with that, let's see, tools, options. So with require variable declaration checked, now when in my editor here, if I choose insert a module, then this line shows up at the top automatically. I could type it in myself. That just says, let's put that at the beginning of every module that we create. So option explicit then is the directive that tells the VBA interpreter, listen, if you're going to use a variable, Mr. Programmer, if you're going to, or Mrs. Programmer, or Miss, whoever you are, programmer, if you're going to use a variable, you must declare it. Now, let's just kind of take a look at what some of the options are here. So let's say I've got some sub, I'll call it object 1 or something. And normally, if I was going to use a variable, I would say, dim x as an integer, integer, x equals 5, and then print x. So of course, if I run that, it is just going to display, 5 up here in the immediate window. Now, if I forget to declare this, I've just commented that line out, so it's no longer executing. And I try to run this, it's going to say, hey, you put x here, but you haven't defined that variable. That happens because this option explicit directive is on. If I turn that off and run it again, the code will run just fine. And so this is really kind of a weird thing about the language Visual Basic for applications. And that is that if you don't declare your variables, you can just use them. And remember that the philosophy of the language behind VBA is that if the user forgets to do something, we want to do our best to try to figure out what they meant. And instead of just stopping and saying, sorry, you did something wrong, it's going to actually try to figure it out. And that's what it does here. And it's a little bit dangerous. Imagine if this variable wasn't x, but it was some much longer variable. So let's do it this way. Let's dim this as earnings before EBIT. What is earnings before? Oh, interest and tax. INTEREST and tax. I typed so poorly that I would never really make a variable name that long. And that one actually may be, do I have a space in there? I don't have a space. There we go. And so let me just go ahead and assign that to some value that's a little more respectable. And then try to print it. So clearly I'm assigning this variable to, what is this, 5 million? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm assigning this to 5 million. And yet when I print it, it's printing as 0. Why is it only printing 0 when I'm clearly assigning to 5 million? What's that? Actually, it's not because it's too big for integer, although that's a good hypothesis. Let's go ahead and change it to double precision floating point number, OUBLE. That will definitely be big enough. I'll go ahead and run that again, and it's still 0. Oh, does anyone see the problem? Yeah. Yeah, I spelled it wrong. These are 2 different variable names. And so what happens when I don't declare the variable, what happens is when the VBA interpreter gets to this right here, it's kind of coming along and it sees the word sub and it goes, great, this is a sub procedure, know just what to do. It sees object _1 and it goes, great, that's the name of the sub procedure. Little parentheses here if we're going to have arguments, they'd be defined here, but we'll talk about that later. But it understands it and it gets to this, earnings before interest and tax. And it says, I have no idea what that is. It's not an object, it's not a method, it's not a property, it's not a built-in function, it's not a reserved word, it's nothing. I don't know what the only thing it could possibly be is a variable. And so it seems, I guess my programmer just forgot to declare the variable. And so it declares the variable and allocates memory for it. Now, of all the types that we talked about, can you guess which type it uses to declare the variable? Yeah, variant. It says, I don't know what you're gonna, I don't even know what this is, what you're gonna do with this thing, but I'm gonna use the most flexible type I can, and so it's gonna declare it as variant. But now here in this case, I've declared the variable, but as somebody pointed out, it's spelled just a little bit differently. And it's really easy to miss, like to see something that was got a couple letters transposed or something, and you really look at that and you think that's the variable, and it's just not the variable. So even though I've declared a variable like this, when the interpreter gets to this one, it doesn't say, well, that's really close to the one that you spelled just the line before. That must be the one you mean. No, because it's different. You must mean some different variable. And so one of the most difficult errors to track down is a misspelled variable name. And so by turning on option explicit, you're now saying, before I can use a variable, I must declare it, which is like turning on a spell checker for your variable names. Because now when I try to run this, it's going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about here. You haven't declared this as a variable. And so I'm not going to let you proceed. And so even though you might think, well, boy, sure would be nicer if I didn't have to declare those pesky variables, just start using them. And it is a little bit easier because it's less code to write. It will be harder for debugging. So that's why I recommend that we turn on option explicit. Any questions on that option explicit directive? It is really just a good habit to be in. Maybe I'll call this option explicit. There we go. Okay, so let's then take a look at, we'll look at the workbook object. So sub workbook object. Okay, so this is actually going to introduce us into a particular kind of object referred to as a collection. So many of the objects that we have access to in VBA are actually kind of pre-built into collections. And one of the collections we have the ability to work with is the collection of all the open workbooks. So let me just come here and do a debug.print of the name of the collection, workbooks. .count. So collections are objects. So a collection is an object, which means it has properties and methods. And one of the property that all collections share is they have to have a property called count, which tells you how many items are in the collection. All a collection is it's an object that holds references to other objects. It's like you can almost think of it as a container that's got objects in it. All it really has is the memory address. The memory addresses of where those objects are, so you can refer to them through that object, through that collection. So let me go ahead and say workbooks.count. And when I run this now, it's going to tell me how many workbooks I currently have open. So I've got just one workbook open, and so it prints one. If I open a new workbook, just come over here and say, Control N, and then run that code again, because there are now two workbooks open, it's going to tell me it's going to do two, because it is the collection of all my open workbooks. It's actually all the open workbooks in this instance of Excel. When I say in this instance of Excel, how many of you are going, I totally know what he means by this instance of Excel. It's like, wow, it's two, maybe three. So So it turns out that when we load Excel into memory, it kind of goes in and kind of the whole program of Excel is loaded in memory. I can launch Excel again and have 2 copies of Excel loaded into memory. And if I do that, those 2 are separate from each other. So I could have workbooks open in both of those separately in each of those 2 instances of Excel. And my VBA code here would only know about the workbooks that are in the first one. Anyone interested to see how to launch a separate instance of Excel? There's not a whole lot of reason that you really want to do that, but occasionally I find it useful. Here's how you do it. So let's see. I'm going to kind of take the lighting off the screen here, but stand by. Oh, I guess I did it. All right, so down here, oh, I hope I remember how to do it. Down here on the Excel tab, if I right-click it, oh, is this right? I'm going to click on Excel, but I'm going to hold the Alt key down. Let's do it. Oh, do I remember? Oh, yeah. You want to start a new instance of Excel. So let me just say that again, because I wasn't quite sure when I said it the first time. You're going to right-click the little, I'm going to right-click the Excel icon in my the taskbar. And then where it says Excel, I'm going to hold the Alt key down and click on that. And that will now, oops, got to hold it down. Got to hold it down until that little dialog box comes open. So Alt, no, right-click it, hold down the Alt, click Excel until the dialog box comes open. Do you want to start a new instance? Yes. Okay, so now if I have a workbook open here, how many instances do I have open? Let's see if it really does see those differently. Let's see. So yeah, I've got one of these is a different instance because I've got 4 workbooks open. Let me see if I can show them all. I'm not sure which one's which. And this one. So I've got 4 instances. I got 4 different workbooks open here. And still, when I run this code, it's telling me I only have 3 because one of those is in a different instance of Excel. And I don't remember which one actually is the different instance, but that's the point. So it's not really the collection of all your open workbooks, it's all the workbooks open in the current instance of Excel. And I'm going to close all of those, except the one that I'm currently working on. Okay, so that should get me back down to 1. Now, does any of you have just one workbook open, and yet when you run this, it says 2? Is that the case for any of you? We talked, last time we were together, we talked about the personal macro workbook, right? If you record a macro into the personal macro workbook, it's going to create a workbook that Excel automatically opens each time you open Excel. If you have that over here in your VBA Project Explorer, it will say personal.xlsb. I think is what it says over here. And that's another workbook that's open and just hidden. So you may get a different number than you're expecting because of if you have the personal macro workbook open. All right, so anyway, so workbooks is a collection. Collection is an object, it's got properties and methods, but workbooks hold references to all the other workbooks that you have open. So now let's do this. Let us say workbooks. Workbooks.add. Any idea what workbooks.add is going to do? Yeah, most collections also have an add method. They don't all have to have an add method, but most of them do. That allows you to add another element into that collection. And that is going to make a brand new workbook. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print the number of workbooks I have. I'm going to call the add method. And I'm going to print again. So that should print 1, and then it should open a new workbook, and then it should print 2. So there's the workbook that it opened, and we see, yeah, it printed the 1, then printed the 2. Okay, so far, pretty lightweight. Next thing that we're going to do is going to be a little bit more, it's just going to require a little bit more focus. So if you've been kind of checking your email, going easy class today, I want you to pay attention closely here. When I say, in fact, very often when I create a new instance of a collection, in this case, a new workbook, the add method is going to return a reference to that newly created workbook. And I can catch that in an object variable. We talked about object variables a couple of lectures ago. We just kind of introduced them and said it's like it is just a nickname for a memory address that holds another memory address. It holds where something else is. So when this creates a new workbook, it is going to load that workbook into memory, and it's going to send back the address in memory where it was loaded. And so if I have created an object variable here, WB as object, I can now say set WB equal to this, and I will now have a way to refer to that workbook in my code. Like that workbook I just opened, I can then later do stuff with it. I can tell it that I wanted to deal with that particular workbook by prefixing the commands I'm interested in with WB. WB dot sheets, worksheets. We'll talk about the worksheets collection here in more detail in a minute. The first worksheet dot cell range A1 dot value equals hello world. So this is going to create the workbook. I'm going to capture the location in memory where that workbook is, and I will be able to use that variable to refer to that newly created workbook. This is especially important if I do something that changes the active workbook, because if I didn't, and when I create that, it's going to be the active workbook. So even if I didn't include this directive to get me to that workbook that was just added, if I just said the worksheets collection, it's going to assume I mean the active workbook. So let's change this. We'll change which workbook is active in the intervening time here. So this workbook is it's an object identifier that resolves to the workbook that has the code that's currently being executed. So this subprocedure is in the workbook called air traffic passenger statistics. And so when I say this workbook, it's like saying, oh yeah, the workbook air traffic passenger statistics. So this will create a new workbook, make it active. This will activate a different one. And this one will say, even though it's not active, we're going to refer to that newly created workbook. I think I'm going to go ahead and step through this by pressing F8. And depending on how your keyboard's laid out, you might have to press function F8 to be able to get it. This will just let me go one line at a time, so we can see these different things happen. So let me split my screen over here. And so pressing F, I hope that mouse still works. Pressing F8. You can see now that it's opened up this new workbook. And as let's go ahead and print out the count, that's fine, F8 account. We'll be able to watch it activate the other one, so it should bring that other workbook up to the surface. And then that is going to put hello world into A1 of the newly created workbook. We can see that it did that there. Now, this introduces a word that we haven't used yet. And it is the keyword set. So to kind of set this up, let me do something a little simpler. So declare x as integer, do the same thing we did before, x equals 5, and debug.printx. Now I'm going to increment x. So I'm going to print it, and then I'm going to change its value. I want it to be one more than it was before. So I'm going to do something that seems a little bit strange at first. X equals x plus 1. Now I look at that statement, x equals x plus 1, and I'm the novice mathematician in me feels a little bit uncomfortable with that statement. Under what condition would that statement of equality be true? When does x equal x plus 1? Do we have any mathematicians among us here? There's actually one case when it does. When x is infinite. Right? Infinity plus 1 is still infinity. And so if x is infinite here, then that statement is true. But yeah, it's a really rare case. But this is not an assertion of equality. What is this? It's an assignment. Yeah, it says take whatever's on the right hand of the equal sign and put it onto what is on the left hand of the equal sign. Now, in the early days of BASIC, you couldn't just say x equals x plus 1. I don't mean the early days of Visual Basic. I mean the early days of BASIC, like go back to the 1970s. And the way that you said this, it was actually more like an English sentence, because you would put the keyword let here. You would say let x equal 5. And to me, it almost sounds like the voice of God, right? Let x equal 5. And by the way, this syntax still works here. So I can say let x equal 5. I'll go ahead and print the next value here. And I can say let x equal to its prior value plus 1. And that should print 5 and then 6. And so when I am working with a primitive data type, so a variable that only has a single value, what are some of my variables that only have a single value? Byte, integer, long, single, double, date, string, like everything except potentially variant and object, right? Object is a reference to, an object that has lots of different properties. So it's a complex data type, but all these other values are just, they're known as primitive types. They're simple, they just hold a value. And so we use the keyword let, but we got tired of typing let all the time. And so they're like, you know what? We can figure it out if you don't put let. We can figure that out. However, when we come down to here and we're going to bind an object variable to an object, we have to use the keyword set. And it's just kind of a quirk of the language. The reason that you have to use the keyword set is because remember that variant type that can behave in lots of different ways? There's a particular case that is ambiguous if you're using a variant data type, where it would say, I don't know what you're talking about. You either got to say let or set here. And if I have to guess, well, it will guess. And you need some way to tell it not to guess that way. And here that is. If you're really interested, at the end of class, I could show that to you, but it's just kind of a weird thing that you don't run across often. So this says so anytime I'm going to connect on an object variable onto an object, I have to use the keyword set. It's just something that you have to learn about VBA. That's why we can't just say WB equals that. We have to say the keyword set. Okay. Let's do this. Let me go ahead and I'm going to save this workbook. I'll put it in my downloads folder. Save as. I'm really kind of curious as to why that's not showing me somewhere to save it. So let me browse. And XLSM. I guess this can be an XLSX. And I'm going to call it WB1. It's a great name. Okay. So now, instead of adding, there's another way I can get a new object into this collection. Add is going to create a brand new workbook. But what might be another way I could get an object into the collection of all open workbooks? I can just open another one, because if I've got another workbook open, then it's going to come to that collection. So let's go ahead and open that workbook that I just saved. So instead of add, I'm going to open, and now I'm going to give it a path to where it is. Now I saved that file in the same location where my workbook, the main workbook I'm working on here is. All right, that's this workbook. It has a property called path, which tells me where is the workbook saved. And so because the actual path for me is different than the actual path for you, rather than hard coding that path to open it, I am going to just say, go get the path of the workbook I'm currently working on, and then open another workbook that's in that same location. Now, if you're on Mac, you need a separator between that path and your workbook, and that's going to be a // If you're on Windows, it's a / or a \\. So fortunately, I can ask which one of those is the right one, and it's actually called the path separator. So application is the name of an object. It refers to all of Excel, and it has a path separator argument, which will be a / if that executes on Windows. It will be a / if it executes on Mac. So I'll just say print that out here, and I can see that in this environment, it's a \. So that allows me to know to put the right kind of separator on wherever this workbook is running. And I called that workbook WB1. So let me just concatenate onto that, the string WB1.xlsx. So now I'm going to bind onto that workbook. It's going to actually open that workbook. And I'm going to print, then the count. We'll activate this one, and we'll put hello world now into B1. Doesn't like the path. Let me just see what we've got here. Read the error message. Sorry, we couldn't find that file. I thought that was what I named it and where I put it. So let me just take a look. Downloads. I must have put it in documents. Yeah, just put it in the wrong place. I'm gonna move it over here to downloads. And we'll try that again. There we go. So it opened that up, it put it, what I was looking for, into B2, everything went fine. But I want to use this to explain something that's probably, as we're just beginning, is like the most frustrating thing about VBA. And that is sometimes you put parentheses around arguments and sometimes you don't. So in this case, I am saying I want to open this workbook. In fact, let's do this. I'm gonna not bind it onto the variable for now. In this case, I don't put parentheses around the argument list. So here I'm saying workbooks.open, and it says, great, what do you want to open? And I've got this expression here that's going to give me this whole thing. Now I'm going to comment out my WB dot because it's not defined here, but I want to show you that this works. Let me close this, save it, don't save, and I'll run this again. And it's still going to open that workbook up just fine. Back when they're making the language, they made a lot of really, really great decisions about this language. This is not one of them. In the vast majority of languages today, you always put parentheses around any argument list that you give, like to the name of a function or to a procedure call. In VBA, and I don't know what they were thinking, why they thought this was a good idea. They say, listen, if you're just making a statement, in other words, you're just telling you to do something, no parentheses. But if you're going to do something with what comes back from that statement, you've got to put parentheses on it. So let me just go ahead and try to bind on to my workbook. Set WB equal to this. Now remember, this is the statement that opens that workbook. But now I'm going to try to bind that object variable on, and this is, well, it immediately knows there's a problem here. What will the problem be if I try to run it? What's the error message? Just syntax error. Wonderful. So this is going to return a value. I'm just going to return the memory address where that workbook was opened. And so the rule is, because I'm doing something with the value that it sends back, I've got to put the argument, I've got to put the argument in parentheses. If you want to know why that's important, I can show you the kind of the weird example as to why this is critical. This will work again just fine. I think we've took out the line that writes that out. Let me close this down, run it again. We should run through and print it onto both cells. And so it's just, this is like a quirk of the language. If I'm doing something with the value that comes back, I've got to put the arguments in parentheses. So right, when I say argument, right, I'm calling it to open, I'm giving it something to do to kind of tell it how this method should run. That's the argument that I'm passing into the method here. Would it be helpful to see the case to understand why you need the parentheses, or are you good just to say, you know what, got to have parentheses if we're doing something, let's move on. If we're doing something with the value that comes back. Does anyone have, see, I saw one person say, let's just move on, which I'm glad to do. Okay. Okay, so this is then working with workbooks. The vast majority of what we're going to do in this class is going to be dealing with exactly one workbook, and it will be the workbook wherein the code is executing. But it's really common to say, I've got to deal with multiple workbooks. We'll have some exercises where we're going to kind of go read all the workbooks in a folder. We'll open them one at a time and kind of work on each one of those workbooks individually. That's like the main exception. So we're opening workbooks, and that's the workbook object. Let's see how to iterate across all of the open workbooks. So another sub. Call it iterate over workbooks. And I'm going to open up one more workbook. So I've got 3 workbooks open now. Now, when we get together next time, we're going to talk about loops in more detail. I'm going to introduce you to one kind of loop here that we're going to get more familiar with next time. But it allows us to iterate over all the items in a collection. So let me dim WB as object. And this is going to be a for each loop for each WB in workbooks. Now, workbooks is the collection of all my open workbooks. WB is an object variable. And what this loop is going to do, but next at the end to say, here's the end of the loop. This is a for each, just call it the for each loop, but the keyword that ends the loop is next. So what's going to happen here is that each time through this loop, this object variable is going to get bound onto one of the elements of this collection. So down here, I bind the object variable WB onto a particular one of a particular workbook. In this case, it's the one I'm opening. In this case, the loop is going to bind, without even using the keyword set, the loop is going to bind this object variable onto each element of this collection one at a time as we go. So I should be able to say, inside this loop, debug.print wb.name. And so I've got one called air traffic passenger statistics. I've got one called WB1, and I've got one that's probably just called book 1. And it's going to refer to each one of those. And even though I'm not ever saying a particular workbook, it's going to do all of those individually, because this variable will get bound onto each one of the elements in that set. So when I run this, it should print all 3 names up here into my immediate window. So not book 1, book 6, because I've opened book 5 books before it today. So when I have a collection of items, I can iterate across the collections by using this structure. Questions? One more thing is really common with collections, and we have identified there's kind of a couple of different ways that I can get at the individual elements of a collection. So sub find one element. So here I've got my my workbooks. Let's just do this, debug.print. Workbooks. Now here's the collection, but if I just put parentheses after it, I can tell it one of the ones I'm interested in. So workbooks sub 1 will refer to the first, I can give an ordinal number, the first element in the collection. These are in the collection in the order in which they were open. So this should be the first workbook that was open. Workbooks 1, debug print, and I'll print the name of it. So it should be just the air traffic passenger statistics because that was the first one that I opened. And so I can refer to them by their ordinal number. The third one is that book 6 that was most recently created. When my objects in a collection have a name, I can refer to them by their name as well. So let me do this. Instead of printing the name, I'm going to specify it by name. Book 6, capital B, and I'll print the address. The path of that. That should be the path to my downloads folder. Because I'm saying identify a particular book in this collection and then ask for the path property of it. Oh, and there's no path to that one because it hasn't been saved. So let's do the one that's WB1. WB1 XLSX. And so that's getting the path to my downloads folder. So the important thing here is that I can, if I've got a collection of objects, I can always refer to the elements of that collection by their ordinal position. If those objects are named, I can almost always refer to them by their name as well. Kind of 2 different ways to get at the elements of that particular set. Questions on this? Let me back up and show one more thing that I meant to show when we are dealing with this object variable here. The generic name for kind of any old object is, or kind of any kind of object is just the keyword object. But I can say, no, I don't just mean any old object. I mean specifically, this can only be workbook objects. And so instead of using the keyword object here, I could use the word workbook here. So dimwb as workbook. That's exactly the same as declaring it as an object, except now the only kind of object that this variable is allowed to bind onto is workbook objects. Before I had this as workbook, when it was just object, I could say, oh yeah, bind it onto a range, bind it onto a sheet, bind it onto a worksheet. But now I've limited it to bind only onto workbooks. But the really compelling reason to do that is because now, if I'm here working in my code, if I say WB and then say dot, it knows that this has to be a workbook object. And so it can give me the IntelliSense help to say, well, here's what you can do with workbooks. It's right here. So by actually giving it the kind of object that I'm allowing it to bind onto, I get the IntelliSense help, and it limits it to the kind of object that it's allowed to bind onto. You guys just show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how comfortable you are with what we've talked about in object variables, like binding, like set WB on. I'm seeing 4s, 5s, 3s, 4s. Okay. I remember when I was first learning this, it was really hard for me to grasp. And it's probably because I didn't have such a great teacher as myself to teach me how to do it. So, yes, question.
You said that because it's workbook object, Excel knows to give you suggestions for different properties or methods.
Yes.
That won't do anything unless you assign the variable WB to a workbook, though, correct? Like in this code, this particular stuff.
Right. Yeah. So let me see if I understand what you're saying is that, even though I can now say WB and it starts to give me like activate is something I can say to a workbook. So even though it's telling me, hey, you could do WB activate here, WB is not bound onto anything. And so if I try to run this right now, it's going to say, well, WB isn't anything. How do you activate nothing? And so this will be an error. Object variable or block variable not set. So it's saying, yeah, you're trying to activate this, but this object variable isn't bound onto anything yet. So even though it's telling me that, it's just the editor saying, oh, you said WB, here's the things that you can put after WB. Yeah. And it's not smart enough to say, well, it isn't assigned yet, so you can't do anything. Okay, is there anything else I want to say about workbook objects? I guess one more method that's probably worth talking about is like the save method. So find one element. Let me go ahead and take this one back to my book 6. Book 6. And yeah, the path is nothing there. So I'm not going to print the path. I'm now going to say dot save as. So workbook 6.save as, I can tell it like the file name, including the whole path. This work.path and concatenated with the path separator. Application dot path separator concatenated with new workbook dot xlsx. So I can say save as and then tell it exactly how to save it. Other thing though that I want to point out here is that the next argument here is the file format. And it would be really great if it told me what the file formats were. There's going to be an enumeration for these. Let me see if I can track it down real quick. So VBA, file format, save workbook. See if we can get the names. The numbers we're after are 51 and 52. Okay. VBA save workbook. Kind of expecting to get one from Microsoft here. VBA file, let's see. VBA workbook. Save as. There we go. Okay, so the file format, here it is, Excel file format enumeration. So these are all the different formats that we could save that file as. We can save it as an add-in. We'll see how to create add-ins towards the end of the class. We can save it back in like version 3 from 1990. Like if you really wanted an old version, you could, and then there might be a reason to do that, but you could actually say save this in that particular format. The default one is like a regular Excel file. I thought it was 51. These aren't numeric in order. Yeah, OpenXML workbook. So there's 51. That is like the default one. So, and this right here is just a constant for that number 51. So if I came back here and said, print that constant, that's 51. So if I put here either 51 or that whole expression, then I'm saying save this as a regular workbook. Now, the reason that you might really want to do this is because you want to save something as a macro-enabled workbook, which is number 52, or this name, right? So again, that's just a constant. It's like a variable. It's a location in memory with a name. It's got a value stored there. The value stored in the location in memory with that name is 52. So I could put here 52, which says save it as a macro-enabled workbook. So in which case I'd want this to actually say XLSM, or I could put the whole long constant there, which says to save it as a macro-enabled workbook. So I'll go ahead and save that, and that should now save that workbook as a macro-enabled workbook. And if I go look in my downloads folder, here's that new workbook.xlsm, which is of that format. If I had left this argument off and told it to save as an XLSM, it would save it with the XLSX file format, and it would have the wrong kind of name on it, and Excel just isn't going to open it. It's going to say, this is something's hinky here because you got XLSM extension, but it's not the right file format, and it would just like prevent it. So saving workbooks is a special method with those arguments to be able to save it to those particular types. The last thing, you go ahead and back that back out. Then one more thing on workbooks is active workbook dot save. Actually, save would just save it. That was pretty straightforward. Close, so you can close a workbook. And the argument that I want to point out to this one is like the first argument here is save changes. It's either true or false. So I can say, what would it mean if I said active workbook close and put a false right here? What would that do? Closes the active workbook, doesn't save the changes, and doesn't prompt the user for it. Oh, I had kind of a fun day one day. Before I had my PhD, I was teaching this stuff like to corporate America. I was flying around the country teaching people how to program in VBA. And we had a class. It was like a class of like 15. It was normal size for the class. Everyone had their computers there in class, and we were working on this stuff. Were you ever in a class where there was like one student who just thought he had to say something annoying about every topic? Did you have that student? Every class I was ever in had a student like that, and it's because it was me, to be truthful. Anyway, this guy had made a couple of annoying comments, and we were just getting to recording macros. You could assign a hotkey to it. And you know, I think we had done that already, and we were just covering this topic right here. And I think I was showing how to save, close, and automatically save the changes, you know, true. So close and save the changes without prompting. That's a handy thing. And he's all, well, how would you make it so that it closed without saving? So, you know, okay, false. And about 2 minutes later, he's sitting in the very back of class. They always sit in the back of class. He was sitting in the back of class, and he just kind of went, this was a funny laugh. We all kind of looked at him. What? And he said, well, I just made a macro that closes the active workbook without saving the changes, without prompting the user. And I assigned it the shortcut key of Control S. Yeah. And we all kind of gave him a little courtesy laugh, and we moved on. About an hour later, it's time to break for lunch, an all-day class. I said, all right, let's go ahead and save your work and let's move on. And he goes, huh, what? Huh? Oh. The macro was still open, or that workbook was still open. So that meant that hotkey was still remapped. And even though we were on a different workbook, when he hit Control S, it did exactly what that macro did. We had a good hearty laugh when we realized what had happened. So that was good. All right. So that's working with workbooks. So let's move on to a different collection. Let's take a look at the worksheets collection. So sub work sheets. E-E-M-O. dim WS as a worksheet. And let's just, I'm going to work on my active workbook, or I'm going to work on this workbook, see how many sheets we've got here. So we've got passenger statistics and charts. So this workbook that we downloaded has a couple of different sheets on it. So let's just do this. Let's just do a little for each loop, for each WS in. Now, what do you think the name of what's the name of the collection for all the worksheets in a workbook? If workbooks is the one for workbooks, what is it for worksheets? Worksheets, yeah. Now I can prefix this with the workbook that I'm interested in. So this workbook, so the workbook that holds the code, and this will then be all of the worksheets there that are in that particular, all the worksheets that are in that particular workbook. Next, and print the names of these. ws.name, and so I should get charts and whatever air traffic statistics that was the name of those two sheets. So air traffic passenger statistics and charts. So I've just iterated across those sheets. I can do the same kinds of things. I can make a new sheet, sheets.new. I could bind on a worksheet variable onto that the same way I do with workbooks. Do you want to see those examples, or can you extend from this, from what we've seen now that you know that there's a worksheets example, a worksheets object? Let's go ahead and look at something that's a little bit, maybe a little bit unexpected here. I'm going to do something that's going to delete worksheets. Delete all sheets but one. And this one's going to work on the active workbook. So I'm going to make sure that I don't have my, in fact, maybe I'll bind onto it by name. So I've got this new workbook.xlsm. Go ahead and put a few more sheets on. Set WB equal to workbooks. In fact, maybe just so I'm sure that I'm not deleting over anything, I'm going to make a new workbook here to play with this. So set WB equal to workbooks.add. I'm going to add some worksheets onto this. So WB gets me that workbook that I just created. .worksheets.add. Maybe I'll add on a few worksheets. And I will stop right here. Stop is just going to tell me to kind of interrupt my code. Don't actually stop executing it. Don't dump it out my code out of memory. Just kind of pause right here, and then we'll do some more lines to move on. So when I run this, it should give me a new workbook open, and it should have a bunch of sheets. So sheet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in reverse order. Okay, so now I've got that collection. I'm still in break mode here. I've got this yellow line on. I guess it wouldn't hurt to let it die. Probably better I do that. Let's do that. Let me just go ahead and close this one without saving the changes. WB.close false. And just run that code through. And that's closed that workbook. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I would like to kind of iterate across, write the code to iterate across and delete those worksheets. Well, we know how to iterate across that set of collection, that set of those worksheets. So let me dim WS as a worksheet. Set WS equal to work WB dot worksheets. Oh, sorry. I want this to be a loop. For each WS in WB.worksheets, WS.delete. Now that's going to try to delete every single one, and there's at least going to be an error when I try to delete the very last worksheet. Can you have a workbook with no worksheets in it? You can't do that. You can't delete the very last worksheet. So that should cause an error. I'm curious to see when it causes the error. I'm going to go ahead and run this code. And then I'm going to step through again by using F8 just to go one line at a time. Oh, that's going to be annoying. Do we want to delete it? Yes. So I'm going to just drag this down to close that workbook. We'll start this again. I'm going to add one more line of code in here. Before I start this loop, say application dot display alerts equals false. So when I do something with VBA that would normally cause an alert, like deleting a worksheet, like you delete a worksheet, Excel is going to say, oh, it's a pretty severe thing, deleting a worksheet. Are you sure you want to do it? If I say display alerts at the application's display alerts property false, it's going to say, okay, you know what you're doing. We're not going to nag the user for this. Let's try this again. Yeah, question?
So why is it application.display alerts equals false, but the bottom line is workbook.close false?
Oh, yeah. So how comes sometimes you're saying an equal sign here and sometimes you're not saying an equal sign here? That's a really good question. So in this case, this is a property. So the display alerts property is either true or false. And so I'm just kind of toggling that one way versus the other. Close is a method. And so I'm giving an action to the workbook. I'm telling you, hey, close yourself. And this then is an argument that goes to that method, that tells that method how to behave. So when I'm changing a property, I'm going to do it with an assignment statement. Whereas in this case, this is just an argument telling close how to behave. Okay, so I'm going to use F8 to kind of go one line at a time here. I've deleted that one. It's going through, deleting another one. Insert, must first insert a new sheet. So I can't, it's saying you can't delete the last one. And so we debug right to there and see what I ended up with. Yeah, got right back down to sheet 1. So I can, I can do activities to the work. We not just print out their names, but you can kind of go through and, once we learn more about how to do conditional branching, like the if statement, we can kind of look at the worksheets and decide which ones to delete as I kind of go through this whole set of worksheets and so forth. Questions on the worksheet collection? Okay, let's look at another collection. So here I've got, I look at my charts sheet, this air traffic passenger statistics. This is like, I don't know, outbound flights from San Francisco International Airport, like what's their destination? So kind of this range over these periods of years. I don't know what's happening in South America, but anyway, that's what the different destinations look like. Just before 2008, they weren't flying directly to the Middle East, and then they started, and it's kind of gone up mostly. Okay. But each one of these charts now is an object that's going to be in a collection. And there's a couple of different collections that we can use to refer to these. And so let's first just see what it takes to iterate across all of these objects that are on the sheet. So call it shapes demo. So we'll declare a worksheet variable, dim.ws as a worksheet. Set WS equal to this workbook dot worksheets. And the one we're interested in is the one named charts. Is that what it's called? Charts. So now I've got this workbook variable called WS. That just gets me a reference to that particular sheet. Now what I want to do is I want to iterate over all of the shapes that are on that sheet. So here's the secret. A chart is actually contained inside a shape. There is a chart object, but the chart object does not go directly onto the worksheet. The chart goes into a shape and the shape goes onto the worksheet. And so let's just declare a variable for that. We dim SHP as a shape object. And then let's say for each shape in ws.shapes. Next. I think these charts all have names. sh.name. So that should print off the names of those charts. It's not going to be very interesting. I think it's probably going to be like chart 1, chart 2, chart 3. SHP. Or chart 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So just what does that mean? It means the first 3 charts that I made when I was making this worksheet, I ended up deleting. And charts 5 through whatever moved on here. So the reason that this can be really helpful, it turns out that the shape then controls how big the chart is, it controls where the chart is placed. And so I could, as I say, I wanted to make sure that all of my charts were exactly the same size on this sheet. I thought I silenced my phone. Okay, phone. Here we go. Let's print the name and let's print the width. So these are right now all 360 somethings wide. Well, let's say I wanted to make them bigger. Or let's make them smaller. So right now they're kind of nicely spaced out. Let's just make them a little bit not quite as wide. So I'm printing the name. Let me just say shp dot width equals 300. So 60 somethings might be smaller. And that should iterate across all of those charts and change the width of them. We can make them bigger, 380. Now they should overlap just a bit. Or put them back to 360. So being able to iterate across the set of shapes on a sheet can be really handy. Questions here? We do a little more work to organize these charts. Okay, let's do that. Be our last example for today. Let's reorganize these charts so that instead of being in a grid, they go kind of in a column all the way down the left-hand side. So to do that, what are we going to need to do? We're going to need to set the left property of them all to like 10 or something. That's probably about where they are, 5 or 10. And then each time we do another one, we've got to move it down and see what the height of these things is. So they're 216 tall. So why don't we just set it to like 250? So we'll put the first one at 250, and then we'll just kind of keep adding 250 onto it. So instead of changing the width here, let's change the left of these, set that equal to 10. And then let me see my for loop. Let me get my for loop tabbed in so I can see the structure a little bit better. Let me keep track of the top positions. So let me dim top as a single. I know that you can, even though we won't do it, I know that you can move these around at less than unit. So you could put it at 360.1 or something. And so let's give that a initial value. Top equals, it's going to have to be, maybe 200. So we're going to set the left to 10, and we're going to set the top property to the top variable. That might look a little bit strange to say shape.top equals top. Well, Shape.top is the property of this object, and so it's not going to be confused with a variable named top. We're then going to add 250 onto top, so the next time through the loop, our top is going to be a little bit further down. So we'll get these things to line up going down the left-hand side. So top equals what it used to be plus 250. And so that should just reorganize where all those charts are living. We've got them all now equally spaced going down the left side. You may not be surprised to learn that ranges, there's collections of ranges, collections of cells as well. There's kind of so much to deal with the range object that we'll have a kind of a whole topic just on how we manipulate ranges. But this is kind of a quick look at the different kinds of built-in objects that we work with. Any questions? Well, let's call it good for today. Oh, one more question, go ahead. Sure. Yeah, the question is, could we just make the first chart this width? And I bet you could figure out how to do it, because remember that we can refer to objects either by their name or by their ordinal position. So chart size. Let's just go ahead and get this identified to the same place. So let's just say WS dot shapes number 3 dot width equals 500. Make it really wide. So now our third chart should be wider than the others. So of course you want to do the first one, it's just number 1 there in the chart. Okay, that's it for today. And I think there technically is homework due tonight, so make sure you get that create a web query, which requires no VBA. It's just making a web query. And then I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks for coming. Class dismissed.